In 2013, young US citizen Colin Madsen arrived in the Russian city of Irkutsk, around 2,500 miles east of Moscow. Close to the banks of the sprawling Lake Baikal, and near the Russia-Mongolia border, Colin had arrived in one of Siberia's most well-known cities to begin a new life. But what happened next was far from what he planned, as his adventures turned awry and he met a grisly and mysterious fate. And no one seems to know what happened to him. This is the mysterious death and cover-up of Colin Madsen. Colin Madsen was a keen adventurer. He loved experiencing and exploring new cultures, and immersing himself in his adventurous faraway travels. He'd visited many places. He spoke Russian, Spanish, and English, and he was learning Japanese and Icelandic. But more than any of that, Colin Madsen was an eager outdoorsman. In March of 2016, he was 25 years old, and he was living in the Siberian city of Irkutsk for over 2 years. While there, he'd been helping to develop the Great Baikal Trail, a vast network of long and short hiking trails centered on, near, or around Lake Baikal, the largest freshwater lake on the planet. One of the most popular hiking areas in Russia. Lots of tourists and travelers visit the region for views, vistas, steep hikes, and other outdoor adventures. Aside from working, learning, and studying the region, Colin also spent a lot of time exploring the mountainous trails himself. He and his friends would frequently hike and camp in lots of the area's remote regions, exploring lots of the tough and challenging terrain. He also volunteered with Greenpeace, supporting their work in and around the city. Greenpeace is a publicly funded company interested in protecting the planet, its environment, and its natural assets. According to their website, they're concerned with, quote, investigating, documenting, and exposing the causes of environmental destruction. Like other Greenpeace members and associates, Colin wanted Irkutsk and its surrounding areas to be properly protected from the region's large-scale industrial activities. So, on March 27th, 2016, Colin and 3 of his friends were due to set off on another hike. The party was made up of Colin himself, another American citizen, and 2 Russian natives. They were planning to trek to the top of Love Peak, a challenging summit measuring in at around 2,400 meters. A group of seasoned and experienced hikers. They had all the skills, equipment, and preparation required to attempt the short but challenging 3.5-kilometer trek. They were overnighting at a rudimentary wooden cabin in Arshan, a popular but basic hiding hub around 200 kilometers west of Irkutsk. The 4 went to bed at around 2 a.m., ready to wake at around 5 a.m. and set off on their hike. But when Colin's friends woke up at the agreed-upon time, they were surprised by what they found. Colin had disappeared in the dead of night, leaving his backpack and other belongings behind. A frantic search began, and as it proceeded, things became very suspicious and strange. Here's what we know. Sometime between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., Colin Madsen had left the group's cabin without explanation. He hadn't woken anyone up. He left no indication of his whereabouts, and his 3 friends had absolutely no idea where he'd gone. They waited for 2 hours, until 7 a.m., hoping he might have gone on some small solo adventure, but Colin, of course, never returned. Understandably worried, Colin's friends began to panic. They spoke to nearby villagers, but no one could remember seeing their friend, and no one had any idea where he was. Quickly, Colin's friends became suspicious. Colin Madsen was well acquainted with exploring very remote, rural, and adventurous areas. But both Arshan and Love Peak were relatively well explored, and both were pretty popular tourist destinations. If Colin Madsen was going to get lost, surely he wouldn't get lost here of all places. Soon after some basic searches of their own, Colin's friends contacted police, who seemed strangely disinterested in finding Colin. Instead, they instigated investigations by allegedly holding his friends captive for almost 20 hours without food or water. According to his friends from the Siberian Times, quote, "When Colin went missing, for the whole day, we tried unsuccessfully to contact the police for help. Despite this, the investigators immediately began to push the theory that his disappearance was our fault, or his own fault. From the first minute, the investigators made it clear that they did not like us. They did not like our appearance. It was also strange to them that we did not have alcohol, but had books with us. So it was concluded that we killed Colin, and then made sexual intercourse on his dead body. They also voiced the version that we had dismembered and buried his body." After Colin's friends repeatedly and vehemently denied these allegations, the hunt for Colin continued. By now, a huge number of people were involved. Many of Colin's other friends had joined the effort, while police and other authorities were also involved in the search. Colin's mother had even arrived from the States in the hope that she might be able to retrace her son's steps. On the 8th day, the search party finally found Colin, but it wasn't a relief. The moment the search party found Colin's body, they noticed a number of strange and suspicious things. It didn't appear that he'd simply been lost, or that he stumbled or fell. Colin was found lying flat on his back, almost fully outstretched, in a patch of grass under a tree. One of his arms was outstretched to the side, while his fists were tightly clenched. His bootlaces were untied, his boots were very clean, and he wasn't wearing any socks. According to some sources, some of his clothes were torn, his trousers were partially pulled down, and his eyes and mouth were open. His pockets contained his wallet, US passport, and some cash, making it very unlikely that he'd been robbed. All of these documents and articles were in very good condition, with no signs of decomposition or mold. Colin's body also showed very few signs of decomposition. Immediately, Russian news outlets chalked Colin's demise down as nothing but an accidental death. According to them, another unprepared hiker had died after wearing too few clothes and taking too few precautions in a cold and hostile environment. But according to Colin's friends and family, this made no sense. Usually, hypothermia victims are found curled up in a fetal position, but Colin was completely flat on his back. And this doesn't explain his lack of socks, untied shoes, or the tears in his clothes. All in all, it seemed like a pretty unlikely explanation, especially for such a seasoned hiker. In the words of Colin's mother, quote, "He would have never walked to a place in the pitch dark, with his shoes unlaced, no socks, and when he was leaving for a climb in just a few hours that he was so excited about." She also noted, quote, "Colin had bilateral ankle surgery the year before, and could not hike or walk very far without socks. The boots rubbed on the scars without socks, and it really bothered him." After brief, superficial investigations after the discovery of Colin's corpse, police claimed that Colin had wandered into the woods and, quote, "froze to death after taking cannabis." But this wasn't even remotely supported by the findings of the autopsy. There was a very small amount of cannabis detected in Colin's urine, but it was way lower than the thresholds used by the world's anti-doping agency. Colin might have smoked some in the days leading up to his death, but nowhere near enough to make him lost, confused, or disoriented, especially in a place he knew so well. There was also no alcohol present in his system. During investigations, all of Colin's hiking companions were also drug tested. None of them were positive for any substances, including alcohol and cannabis. Police were insistent that Colin had smoked, gone for a walk, become lost, and frozen to death. But Colin's friends persistently claimed that the investigators' assumptions were way off the mark, repeatedly claiming that Colin knew this area very well. He was a trail leader in the region, he had helped to map some of the area's trails, and he was always fully and properly prepared. Colin's friends also refuted official claims that Colin could have frozen to death. They maintained that the weather was actually pretty warm, and that Colin's thick thermal shirt would have offered more than enough protection against the chill. According to his friends, it was very unlikely that Colin could have died of hypothermia. In their opinion, there had to have been some other explanation behind their friends' demise. And here's where things get even stranger, and where the holes in this case become larger. When a US funeral home received Colin's body, he was heavily dressed and wearing lots of makeup. When the funeral home undressed him and removed this makeup, they noticed marks and injuries on Colin's hands and wrists. What's more, official investigations didn't mention or account for these wounds, or the rips and tears in Colin's clothing. According to some sources, there was even some evidence of blunt force trauma to Colin's head. Even more disturbing, independent investigators began to suspect that Colin had died in one location before being moved to another. No animals had scavenged on Colin's corpse. There were very few signs of decomposition, and the search party had already been in and around the area in which he was found. Colin was discovered only around a mile outside of Arshan, in an exposed patch of land, making it kind of unlikely that the search team could have overlooked his body. Based on these disturbing findings, some started to believe that Colin had been tortured, bound, killed, and beaten in one location before his body was moved to another. But theories about who might have killed him were even more shocking. In the months leading up to his death, Colin had been heavily involved with Greenpeace and their actions and demonstrations in and around Irkutsk. Authorities didn't like what Greenpeace were doing in the area, and they even threatened Colin on numerous occasions, warning him to stop. According to some local witnesses, officers were often very hostile to lots of Greenpeace members and associates, including Colin himself. During Greenpeace demonstrations, police quickly and frequently became very aggressive, and this aggression continued during investigations into Colin's death. According to some sources, when a translator arrived in the area to investigate Colin's disappearance, she was yelled at and spat at by a police officer, who allegedly claimed that Colin was gay and that he and his friends were in the area to host an all-male orgy. Yeah. Because of this hostility and aggression, some have theorized that Colin might have been killed by authorities, who, after his death, were then trying to cover their tracks. In interviews, police attempted to pressure Colin's friends into claiming they'd beaten him to death during a drunken fight. But according to those same friends, authorities became visibly frustrated when they realized that the trekkers never, or very rarely, drank alcohol. Police even forced them to undertake polygraph tests. For whatever reason, authorities were very keen to antagonize and intimidate Colin's friends. But why? Is it because they were trying to find a scapegoat for their own actions? Lucas Fagra, the US native who was part of Colin's trekking troop, was even advised by the US Embassy to leave Russia in the wake of Colin's death. Speaking to reporters, Lucas said, quote, "I left Russia out of fear that I would be detained. I got a ticket back to the States and was on a plane within 24 hours. In some ways, it's kind of difficult to believe that Russian authorities would have killed Colin Madsen. But one huge and suspicious piece of evidence makes his accusation appear pretty reasonable. Now, according to some reports, Colin, on the night before his death, was wearing a very unique necklace, featuring a number of snakes. When Colin's body was found, he was no longer wearing this necklace. But when police returned Colin's belongings to his mother, they allegedly returned this necklace, along with the other objects. Does this indicate that the police were somehow involved in Colin's death? How did they get their hands on his necklace? Police forces have closed official investigations into Colin Madsen's demise. But lots of independent investigators believe the case is far from over. Ivan Pavlov, the lawyer who represents Colin's mother, refuses to believe the real cause of Colin's death has ever been uncovered. He claims, quote, "We contend that the investigation's findings of Madsen's non-violent death are not based on factual circumstances," unquote. And it's not hard to see why he feels this way, as lots of bizarre unanswered questions have been left behind. One of the biggest mysteries still surrounding the case is, why did Colin Madsen leave his wooden cabin in the middle of the night, with little equipment and without any of his friends? According to the autopsy report, Colin had a full bladder when he died, so it's likely he left the cabin simply to pee. But even if he did, who or what killed him? And why wasn't his body found near the outhouse restroom? For many, the strangest aspect of the case is the apparent confusion over when Colin actually died. There was little evidence of decomposition on his body, and many indications that he hadn't been lying in the same place for several days. If Colin didn't die on the day he disappeared, as most people believe, when did he actually die? Did he die the day he was discovered? And if so, where was his body in the days and hours before he passed away? Was Colin Madsen killed by Russian authorities because of his work with Greenpeace? Or did someone else kill Colin, with authorities eager to cover it up, reluctant to admit that a foreigner was brutally murdered on their soil? Sounds extreme, but that's what Colin's mother seems to believe, stating, "I think something happened, and they didn't want it to appear that an American had been murdered in Russia." More cynical theories suggest that Colin might have been killed by his friends, another set of hikers, or perhaps the villagers who lived in the local area, but I consider those to be not too likely. And of course, there are those who believe Colin might have killed himself, but there's no evidence that he did. And by all accounts, he seemed pretty normal in the days leading up to his death. One of Colin's friends perhaps summed the case up best when he said, quote, "I don't know. Just a lot of things are off." Colin's mother still believes the case is yet to be solved, accusing authorities of intentionally covering up her son's death and undertaking only the barest and most superficial of investigations. She's even offered $10,000 of her own money to anyone who could help solve the case. Whatever happened, it would be relatively easy for someone to commit a murder in this area. It's remote and rural, and the harsh weather and vast landscape can make things disorienting and confusing. It's the perfect place for the perfect crime. And if Colin Madsen was murdered, we might never know who did it. What do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. I'm actually kind of curious to see what people think of this one. And if you have any evidence you believe might be able to solve the case, please get in contact with the right people. Together, we might be able to bring some peace and closure to Colin Madsen's family. Until then, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care.